Hello there, students of economics. Welcome to this teaching module titled Economic Reforms 1991. In this video, we will deal with liberalization, which is one of the strategies and a part of the new economic policy of 1991, a policy that came about as a result of the economic crisis of 1991. So the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh brought about the threefold policies of liberalization, privatization and globalization. So we will deal with liberalization first. Rules and laws which were aimed at regulating economic activities became a major block for growth and development. Thus, liberalization was introduced to put an end to restrictions and open up various sectors of the economy. Now, what is liberalization? You can see in the picture, there's a hand, and in that hand you have a word wall, which is having all words related to liberalization. So you have words that stand out like empower, progress, let go, set free, transform, release, unchain, shed, evolve. So here are the words that kind of, give us an idea of what liberalization may be all about. So liberalization is a process of freeing the economy from various restrictions and regulations and opening up the various sectors of the economy. So when we talk about restrictions and regulations, we mean all the rules and the licenses that were there, which did not allow freedom of economic activities. A few liberalization measures in areas of industrial licensing, export-import policy, technology upgradation, fiscal policy, and foreign investment was started around 1991. Under the liberalization policy, various reforms were introduced under various sectors. For example, industrial sector reforms, financial sector reforms, tax reforms, and trade and investment policy reforms. We will study each of them thoroughly. So here we go. Let's study about the industrial sector reforms. In India, there were many restrictions like industrial licensing. What is industrial licensing? The permission of government officials to start or close a firm or even decide the amount of goods to be produced. Industrial licensing was abolished for all except the following categories like alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace equipment, which means that only these categories industries had to take a license. The rest were allowed to set up, close, or expand or produce any amount of goods that they would like to produce. So they were not under industrial licenses anymore. Only these industries had to take a license. The only industries now reserved for the public sector are defense equipment, atomic energy, power generation, and railway transport. In many industries, the markets are now allowed to determine the prices. So the industries that are now reserved for the public sector are defense, atomic energy, power generation, and railway transport. All this meant that basically in the industrial sector, they went in for industrial deregulation. So regulation comes from the word rules, right? So removal of rules and restrictions was what the liberalization reforms in the field of industries was all about. So here you have, before 1991, there was industrial licensing for all commodities. The private sector was not allowed in many industries. There were controls on price fixation and distribution. However, after 1991, as a result of the new economic policy, industrial licensing was restricted to certain industries like alcohol, drugs, pharmaceuticals, and so on. Only defense, energy, railway for the public sector. There was large-scale privatization and what we call as disinvestment. Now, what is disinvestment? It is a selling of public sector enterprises by the government. Of course, that money would be further used for productive purposes. Then the market was allowed to determine the prices. So these were the new things that came about. And now moving on to the financial sector reforms. What does the financial sector include? It includes financial institutions such as commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange market, and the foreign exchange market. We know that the financial sector in India is controlled by the central bank or the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, through various norms and regulations. It is the RBI that decides the amount of money that the banks can keep with themselves. RBI fixes the rate of interest and the nature of loans and so on. One of the major aims of the financial sector reforms is to reduce the role of the RBI from being a regulator to a facilitator of the financial sector. This means that the financial sector may be allowed to take decisions of money matters without consulting the RBI, though certain powers have been retained with the RBI to safeguard the interest of the account holders and the nation. So basically, the role of the RBI has been reduced under the new financial sector reforms. But we always have the RBI to protect the interest of the account holders. And so there are certain powers that are still left with the RBI. They monitor the functioning, the working of the financial sector and the monetary policy and so on in the economy. So here we see certain main functions of the Reserve Bank of India, which is our central bank. Now, RBI carries all typical functions along with a variety of developmental and promotional functions to perform their roles. Now, what are their roles? To formulate, implement, and monitor monetary policy, to set up parameters or boundaries for banking operations, to facilitate or help and promote orderly development of the foreign exchange market in India, and of course, to issue or exchange or destroy currency notes and coins that are not fit for circulation. And now moving on to the next reforms, that is in the taxation sector, tax reforms. These are connected with the reforms in government taxation and public expenditure policies, which are collectively known as fiscal policies. So whatever policies of the government that are related to taxation and public expenditure would be collectively known as fiscal policies. Now there are two types of taxes: direct taxes and indirect taxes. What are direct taxes? This consists of taxes on income of individuals as well as profit of business enterprises. Since 1991, there has been a continuous reduction in taxes of individual incomes, as it was felt that the high rates of income taxes was a reason for tax evasion. What is tax evasion? People avoid declaring their income and paying their taxes. So that is called as tax evasion. It is now accepted that moderate rates of income tax encouraged savings and, of course, voluntary disclosure of income. So now that the tax rates are more moderate and reasonable, people now come forward to disclose their income and they also save their money. What are indirect taxes? These are those taxes that are levied or imposed on commodities. Efforts are being made to reform in order to encourage better compliance on the part of taxpayers. Many procedures are being simplified and tax rates are substantially lowered. Now here we have depicted or illustrated the taxation system that is there in our country. So on one hand we have the direct taxes and the other indirect tax. An example of the direct tax is the income tax, and an example of the indirect tax is the goods and services tax that we commonly know as the GST, right? So in an income tax or a direct tax, the taxpayer directly pays the government. The tax is collected by the government directly from the taxpayer. However, in the case of the goods and services tax, which is an indirect tax, the government collects the tax from the manufacturer and retailer. The manufacturer collects the tax from the retailer, and at the end the retailer collects the whole amount of tax from the actual taxpayer, who is the consumer. So therefore we say that the burden of an indirect tax falls on the final consumer. And lastly, under the liberalization policy, we have the trade and investment policy reforms. Liberalization of trade and investment regime was started to increase international competitiveness in industrial production and to bring in foreign investment and technology into the economy. The aim was also to promote the efficiency of local industries and to adopt modern technology. So here you see in the illustration, you have the finance minister at that time welcoming foreign investors. So you have FDI, which means foreign direct investment. So they wanted to bring in new technology, modernize technology, help to increase the productivity of local industries by this way. The trade policy reforms aimed at the following. They wanted to bring out the following through the trade policy reforms. Here they are. Removal of quantitative restrictions on imports and exports. We know that there were quotas. You remember I taught you about what are quotas? They put a restriction on the amount of goods that can be imported or exported. So here in this policy, they removed such quantitative restrictions like quotas. There was a reduction of tariff rates. You remember what are tariffs? Tariff is a tax on imported goods. So this was removed so as to make it easier for trade to take place. There was reduction of licensing of imports. Import licensing was abolished except in the case of hazardous and environmentally sensitive industries. Export duties have been removed to improve India's position in the international markets, which means it is cheaper for Indians to be able to export their goods to other countries. I'd just like to end my teaching module with two quotes, one from Soumya Shaurya, who says, liberalization is what nurtures specialities or talents within a state and in turn makes the nation a prosperous one. I like this quote by Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And he says, the success of a society is to be evaluated primarily by the freedoms that members of the society enjoy. So liberalization does give us freedom in various sectors of our economy. So the economist Amartya Sen is very right in saying this. I think you would agree. So that brings us to the end of this teaching module on liberalization, which comes under Economic Reforms 1991. Study all the matter that you have learned today and you will be ready for the coming up modules. So stay blessed. Thank you for giving me a listening ear.